Hello, I'm Floyd Stokes, your AJ2 Introduction to Law Enforcement instructor at College of the Redwoods. These series of PowerPoint videos are meant to give you an overview of each chapter of the text, but you will still need to thoroughly read each chapter. Today I'm going to discuss Chapter 8, Community Policing and Community Involvement. This chapter has 4 learning objectives. 1. Describe community justice and problem-oriented policing. 2. Define community policing and list justifications for it. 3. Distinguish between citizen involvement in policing and civilianization. And 4. Define third-party policing and provide some examples. Okay, let's get started. First of all, community justice is a relatively new and innovative set of ideas about how the goals of the criminal justice system can be achieved. It favors original, non-traditional approaches to crime control that draw heavily on input and cooperation from the community. Problem-oriented policing, or POP as it is known, is a method of policing that is geared toward identifying and solving problems within a community that are particularly troublesome, and then crafting creative solutions to them. It is also called problem-solving policing. POP is different from community policing, but it can be considered a central part of community policing and community justice. All 3 approaches necessitate an understanding of the geographic area, an in-depth understanding of the problems, and some degree of familiarity with the people in the area where the problems occur. Community policing is difficult to define. Essentially, it is a reorientation of policing philosophy and strategy away from the view that the police alone can reduce crime, disorder, and fear. The strategy is based on the view that the police don't help their communities very much by placing primarily their reliance on random preventive patrolling or rapid response to calls or incident or post-incident investigations to identify offenders, and other like primary reactive criminal justice tactics. Community policing falls within the perspective of community justice in that it is a relatively new approach to law enforcement that is premised on the assumption that the police and citizens must work together to control crime. Community policing emerged in the wake of the Reform era discussed in Chapter 1. Also, as we have already seen, the 1960s witnessed a great deal of strain in relationships between the police and the public. Community era reformers sought community support and improved relationships with citizens and pointed out that traditional police departments, with their paramilitary organization and structure, were inconsistent with the humanistic democratic values of the United States. However, there is more to the community policing movement than meets the eye. Some scholars believe there is. For example, some have argued that the police organizations may have adopted community policing for selfish reasons, such as to make rank-and-file officers more content with their jobs, or perhaps to change the goals of police work from crime control to service, or of shaping public opinion to make officers look good in the eyes of citizens. But whatever the reasons for its present popularity, community policing owes its origins to multiple demands and historical contingencies. The rhetoric of community policing has become more or less institutionalized in American policing. Elsewhere, we have discussed the Violent Crime Control Act of 1994, the creation of the COPS Office in the U.S. Department of Justice, and the billions of dollars in grants to local law enforcement agencies to enhance their community policing capabilities. These and other developments in American policing over the past 2 decades have put the term community policing in nearly every police officer's vocabulary. But is there more to community policing than the term itself? Is community policing really being done, or do police departments just say they're doing it? Two research focuses help us to understand these questions. One, research on structural changes to police departments, and two, research on whether the rank and file are buying into community policing. There are three basic components of community policing. It is a collaborative effort between police and the communities they serve. It involves all elements of the community in the search for solutions, and it identifies problems of crime and disorder and acts on that information. The goals of community policing are clear-cut. 1, to improve community relations. 2, to improve officers' morale. And 3, to improve agency coordination. And community policing has 5 perspectives. The deployment perspective, which emphasizes the fact that police officers are deployed in a way that moves them closer to citizens. Community revitalization, that emphasizes the importance of the police and citizens working closely together to improve neighborhoods and make them safer places. Problem-solving perspective, an approach in which citizens and police work together to identify and respond to neighborhood problems. The customer, that emphasizes the importance of the police listening to citizens and serving their needs. And legitimacy, that emphasizes bolstering the credibility of the police through police-citizen partnerships. Community policing has 4 dimensions. The philosophical dimension, that includes the ideas and beliefs surrounding a new paradigm of policing. 3 ideas underlying community policing are citizen input, an enhanced and broadened police function, and personal service. The strategic dimension consists of the key operational concepts that translate philosophy into action, quote-unquote. Community policing strategies include reoriented operations, for example from cruiser patrol to foot patrol, geographic permanency, for example assigning patrol officers to the same areas for extended periods of time, and an emphasis on crime prevention, for example police officers acting as mentors and role models. The tactical dimension is best understood as the inevitable outcome of the successful implementation of the first 2 dimensions. The tactical dimension of community policing ultimately translates ideas, philosophies, and strategies into concrete programs, practices, and behaviors, to quote-unquote. This dimension stresses constructive interactions between the police and citizens, improved partnerships between law enforcement officials and the public, and problem solving. And then the organizational dimension, though not necessarily a fundamental part of community policing, is essential to its development. The structure of police agencies and their management and information services needs to be adjusted to accommodate community policing through such changes as decentralization, strategic planning, and program evaluation. Some authors note that community policing has become the dominant theme of contemporary police reform in America, quote-unquote. Yet problems have plagued the movement since its inception. For one thing, the range, complexity, and evolving nature of community policing programs makes their effectiveness difficult to measure. Moreover, citizen satisfaction with police performance can be difficult to conceptualize and quantify. Most early studies examined how citizens' attitudes developed through face-to-face interaction with individual police officers. They generally found a far higher level of dissatisfaction with the police among African Americans than among most other groups. Recent findings continue to show that the attitudes of African Americans toward the police remain poor. And of course we have Ferguson, Missouri to give us a real clear example of that. The wider reach of these studies, however, led evaluators to discover that this dissatisfaction may be rooted in overall quality of life and the type of neighborhood. Because most African Americans continue to experience a lower quality of life than most other U.S. citizens, and because they often live in neighborhoods characterized by economic problems, drug trafficking, and street crime, recent studies conclude that it is these conditions of life, rather than race, that are most predictive of citizen dissatisfaction with police. Those who study community policing have often been stymied by ambiguity surrounding the concept of community. Sociologists who sometimes define a community as any area in which members of a common culture share common interests, quote unquote, tend to deny that a community needs to be limited geographically. Police departments, on the other hand, tend to define communities as within jurisdictional, district, or precinct lines, or within the confines of public or private housing developments. Robert Trojanowicz, a well-regarded community policing scholar, once cautioned police planners that the impact of mass transit, mass communications, and mass media have widened the rift between a sense of community based on geography and one based on interest, to quote unquote. Researchers who follow the police definition of community recognize that there may be little consensus within and between members of a local community about the community's problems and about appropriate solutions. Robert Boehm and colleagues at the University of Central Florida have found, for example, that while there may be some consensus about social problems and their solutions, the consensus may not be community-wide. It may in fact exist only among a relatively small group of active stakeholders who differ significantly about the seriousness of most of the problems and the utility of some solutions. Finally, there is continuing evidence that not all police officers or managers are willing to accept non-traditional images of police work. One reason is that the goals of community policing often conflict with standard police performance criteria, such as arrests, leading to a perception among officers that community policing is inefficient at best and at worst a waste of time. Similarly, many officers are loath to take on new responsibilities as service providers whose role is defined more by community needs and less by strict interpretation of the law. Citizen involvement in policing is an alternative approach to community policing that brings citizens to the police in the form of citizen volunteer patrols, such as the Humboldt County Sheriff's Scope, Eureka Police Department's Volunteer Patrol, and Arcata Police's Volunteer Patrol. The Volunteer Patrol citizens are non-sworn, but they are trained, usually in a week-long academy, to participate in preventive patrol, traffic control, and other support activity. Normally, they will patrol in marked vehicles equipped with radios. They can even be authorized to issue parking citations. Civilianization is also a form of citizen involvement in policing, but as non-sworn employees such as dispatchers, computer specialists, and clerical personnel. Use of non-sworn civilians as support staff saves police agencies a lot of money and is looked at as a way to improve service. But it may not all be about cost savings. As the text says, the hiring of civilians is a sign of a progressive, change-oriented agency. Third-party policing is defined as police efforts to persuade or coerce non-offending persons to take actions they might otherwise not take in order to indirectly minimize disorder caused by other persons. Third-party policing pertains to formal methods of policing that invoke the use of civil law rather than the criminal law. Prime examples of this are nuisance abatement and code enforcement. Specifically, in this county, a number of cities, through prodding by their police department, each respective police department have enacted ordinances to civilly fine landlords for allowing their tenants to maintain drug houses, to the tune of hundreds of dollars a day in some cases. Since the burden of proof in civil cases is much less than in criminal cases, that would be a preponderance of the evidence versus beyond the reasonable doubt for criminal cases, they are a lot easier to prove. Here are some examples of third-party policing. This is on the left, the Beat Health program in Oakland, California, and on the right, the Minneapolis Repeat Call Address Policing program known as RECAP. All right, to summarize this chapter, problem-oriented policing is best viewed as part of community policing. Both styles rely on citizen involvement. Community policing is a partnership in which the police and community work together to reduce crime. It addresses citizen dissatisfaction and saves money. Citizen involvement occurs through citizen patrol and citizen police academies. Civilianization refers to hiring non-sworn personnel to perform limited functions within police departments. Finally, in third-party policing, police apply pressure to non-offending third parties, such as landlords, to improve their properties and thereby promote crime control. Before I close, be sure to take a look at the case study shown on page 130 of the text that discusses the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department and its digital partnership with the community. That's it for now.